Jane Coaston, welcome back to the Realignment.
Thank you for having me after some stuff has
Been
happened.
like a month. I think it's been like a month. Last time, I think we waited 6 months before we brought you back, but there's literally been so much happening since then that we're like, all right, it's time to get Jane in here. And before we go, I mean, we mentioned this in the intro. Jane, congratulations on your new role.
Thank you.
Over at The Argument with the New York Times, a podcast we're big fans of. Just had Ross Douthat on. And I think we'll get to a little bit about how you see the future of arguments in American politics in a bit. But first of all, Jane, immediate reactions. What the hell happened? We had this big election. Like, what's going on?
I think it's been interesting because the election seems to have been that, like, there were a bunch of mathy people. And by mathy people, I mean people who know how to do math, who kept telling us, like, there's going to be this red mirage on Tuesday night. And then as mail-in votes are counted, you know, it's going to, like, we're going to know more about what happened. And then we all knew that, and then we all promptly forget, which I think is a very much a human nature thing. Like, you know, it reminds me of basically every story of Genesis. Not to get biblical here, but there's the story of when Moses goes up Mount Sinai to get the 10 Commandments. And he tells everyone, like, okay, I'm going to go talk to God. I'll be right back. And they're like, cool, great. And then he is gone, and you know, obviously the Bible is not doing like a minute-by-minute diary of this, but it makes it seem like he's gone for 20 minutes before everyone's like, let's make a golden calf. He is never coming back. And I'm like, oh my God. So like the history of human nature is that we immediately forgot about the thing that we should have known. I think that the thing that I'm interested in is we're doing that thing again where we're using incomplete exit polling data to make vast conclusions. And I'm not going to make any vast conclusions right now because whatever polling data, we're not going to really get until 2022. Yeah, it's been interesting because I think that the thing that I am surprised by is the down ballot races, obviously the House and Senate. But I also am not going to take massive conclusions from that because if I did learn anything besides this was weird and I don't know, it's that voters, once again, proved to be heterogeneous beings. So you had voters who were like, I want a $15 minimum wage, and I want Republicans to control the Senate. And I'm like,
yes,
sure, cool. Right. Like, we're gonna decriminalize heroin, but Republicans should control the Senate. And I'm like, okay, cool. Yeah, that sounds right. And I think that really has to go with, like, how disconnected policies are from the people and how people can very much think that they can vote for a particular policy platform, but they don't want to vote for the people who are most associated with that policy platform.
Right.
And that interests me, but I have no explanation for why that is, besides the fact that I think, once again, what we've learned is that the people who follow this for their jobs are like the worst political knowers ever. Like, we know too much, which means we don't know anything.
I completely agree with that.
Yeah, what's interesting, I get your point about how we have to wait till 2022 from a sort of empirical perspective, but there are a lot of take-havers and people with skin in the game who are going to have to make some sort of argument coming into February. So, for example, obviously we need to wait a bit to see if the multiracial Latina, Black male coalition is something Republicans can sort of get, but the viability of that coalition is something people are going to have to debate in the next year. So how should the people having those debates think about that, given your point about the data being incomplete? You guys can't see Jane smiling, and I really wish you could because it's very important.
It's weird because I'm like, could you just not make conclusions? Like, could we just like reschedule our conclusion having for later? Like, just push it off. I mean, I understand. I think that one of the most educational pieces I read recently, and I think, Sagar, I linked you to it on Twitter, was the Wall Street Journal reporting on Latino voters and a very specific population of Latino voters in the Rio Grande Valley, who essentially were like, well, Trump had his name on these checks that we got, and our jobs are dependent on this specific industry, and it seemed like gas prices went down when he was president, so that seemed logical. And I'm like,
yeah.
Like, so I think that how much of this is an economic metric? Like, I know that there are a lot of take-havers who want this to be, like, about quote-unquote wokeness, which I think that until we get like a brass tacks definition of what wokeness is, where wokeness is somehow like it's not this, but it is this, and people like this form but not that form, like we can't really have a debate about it. I think that it's the economic argument, and especially it's going to be interesting because you're going to see the same people who just got a lot of votes from a multiracial population, especially a multiracial working class population in specific industries and specific areas, because Arizona Latino voters and Native Americans voted differently than folks in the Rio Grande Valley, then voted differently from Venezuelan immigrants in Florida, because all the like, I think that this is why I joke online all the time about the Black community Zoom that we obviously, Marshall, all have. It's very long. And because there is this like, oh, the Black community did this. And I'm like, I did not get an email. No one told me. But like this idea of this monolithic community, especially with Latino Americans, where that postulation never really made that much sense anyway, where you're trying to tell me that like a community of folks who emigrated from Cuba in the early 50s and this community of people who arrived from El Salvador in 2002 are going to have similar political interests. It doesn't make any sense. I do think it's going to be interesting to see the same party that just won over those voters with a specific economic message now go into what I think they're going to go into, which is deficit hawkery, where you're not going to get a second round of stimulus because why would you do that? Because the deficit's bad. And you're going to see, I think that there is going to be an interesting shift where you had folks who voted on largely economic lines. Obviously, I know abortion was a big issue for some of these voters, but you're going to see that, and then you're going to be like, well, you voted for us on these reasons, but will you take deficit hawkery and these concerns about like culture war stuff that maybe, that all is reliant on whether or not you know what Harper's Magazine is? Like, I'm interested to see how that calculus works out, because it does seem to be a fascinating economic response where it is based on an understanding of what the president does, whether or not that's correct or not. I think that the idea that like he is responsible for these economic conditions is something that we've seen throughout administrations. This concept that like the president is in charge of the economy and gas prices, when that's actually not a thing, but many people believe it is. So in some ways it kind of is a thing. I think that juxtaposition of an economic message and an understanding of what that economic message ultimately means for individuals, I am interested to see how that plays out, especially in a Republican Party that, as I've said, I don't know if it's entirely committed to that economic messaging going forward.
I completely agree with you. And I have been fighting the same battle. I mean, I put out a very simple take, which
the Twitter battles.
The Twitter battle. I was like, look, I mean, for all the takes about, and look, I agree, how else could you explain like Florida passed 60% minimum wage, also votes historically Republican, plus California votes down like affirmative action, like the cultural piece was there. But I was like, guys, actually, like if Trump had sent another round of checks, like I think he would have won re-election. You would not believe the amount of pushback, that I got for that take. And it just seems so unequivocally true, especially based upon, look, once again, it's a small segment of the Rio Grande Valley, but they're like, hey, this guy like signed these checks, my name on it. And I'm like, that's the most basic form of politics, right? Like, you don't need to know about Harper's. You don't need to know about like Barry Weiss leaving the New York Times or like the internal Slack drama. You're like, this guy put his name on a check and it made my life a lot better. So I decided to vote for him. It's just like this base level of politics. But you're exactly right, Jan. I want to get into the future, the GOP question. I just saw a Washington Examiner piece about how Republicans are all getting ready for deficit hawkery. And it seems to me, this is something Marshall and I have been talking a lot about, is about how electoral coalitions, what we really learned in 2016 and 2020, are living, breathing organisms. They respond to the conditions of the time. How else can you see like fluctuations in populations and cross-educational lines and so much? So if the GOP does revert back to that, it just seems so clear to me that they're going to lose, because that not only will they betray these newfound voters in their coalition, but there are also parts of the Democratic coalition that were Republican that I don't think are coming back. And that's part of the thing I want to get with you. Do you agree with that? Like, do you think that there are such a thing as a Biden Republican, which is just like a Joe Biden center-left voter now? Could they ever come back? Maybe they're wrong and I'm right. Or maybe I'm wrong and they're right. What do you think?
I think that there is a sensibility that, okay, like, I feel as if the idea that the Biden Republican then returns to Republican politics means that somehow a quote unquote Biden Republican would get to return to a Republican Party that they quote unquote recognize, which that's not happening. Like, that's just not. We're not like, there are people who are like the grand halcyon days of Paul Ryan, and that's not a thing that's happening now. Whether or not we go back to deficit hawkery and whether or not those Tea Party Express mailing lists really go back into full thrust. I mean, they still are around, they still exist, but they seem way less concerned about spending than they are about other things. I think that, and you're right, that coalition building it ebbs and flows. And one of the challenges I think that Democrats have had is that there's been a lot of talk. There is someone who writes for Hot Air named Karen Townsend, who I think routinely has takes where I'm like, I've got a lot of questions about it. But she was talking about like, the widening of this Republican coalition to now include conservative Democrats, which I'm like, maybe. But one of the challenges Democrats have had is that tent has grown. And that's been this whole thing about the infighting or purported infighting, which is that like you've got people who are convinced that if only we were more like X, we would win more races, which is an almost impossible thing to say because win more races where? Like, yeah, Abigail Spanberger has to be like this to win here, but Ilhan Omar can be like that and win there. Like, the American population is rich and vast, and some people really want like a stalwart leftist message, and some people absolutely do not. I got a lot of education watching Big Ten football a couple of weeks ago, which means like I watched on Hulu, which means I watched more campaign ads that were aimed at the state of Michigan than I'd seen campaign ads in like years, because nobody does campaign ads in DC except Trump because, well, yeah. And it was interesting how not only did most of the campaign advertising in Michigan not mention Trump at all, whether or not it was Republican or Democrat, so much of it had to do with like Michigan values. And we care about like these specific, like these halcyon, tried and true working class messaging, whereas our opponent hates you, hates America, hates your family, hates you personally. And it was just interesting because I think that the entire, like the widening of the Democratic tent, I think that that is going to continue. Something that I find fascinating for what this means for Republicans is how much, we've talked before about Trumpism and the concept of Trumpism. And I think that what we're seeing right now is that Trump, as he understands Trumpism, it is dependent on him and himself. It is not, there is no standard bearer for Trumpism who is not Trump. And I think that'll be interesting going forward because you have seen how the Republican Party, it won down ballot without mentioning Trump at all, but now is very much dependent on Trump. There was some reporting dealing with the Georgia races that are going to runoffs, where those candidates have endorsed Trump's "I actually secretly won as long as you only listen to me" monorail beliefs, because they don't want him to say mean things. But which I find fascinating because, again, if you watch kind of swing state commercials or messaging, so much of that was like, I'm going to do what's best for Michigan. I thought it was interesting in Michigan's Republican senatorial candidate, a couple of his ads were like, when the president's wrong, I'll tell him he's wrong. When he's right, I'll tell him he's right. And it was very much like, I am my own man, which is a fascinating argument that was a big shift from earlier this year. But again, I think that as these ebbs and flows take place, I don't know what'll happen. And it'll be interesting because I think that this is one of those moments in which I actually think that the punditry is doing us a real disservice, because there are lots of things, Marshall, that you care about, and Sagar, that you care about, and that I care about, that the people who are voting en masse do not give a fuck about. And so when you heard people who were saying like, this race was won there's someone who was tweeting, as people are wont to do, about like, this came down to Brett Kavanaugh and to Nicholas Sandman at Covington Catholic. And I'm like,
right.
No, it didn't. Like, I will believe.
It literally didn't, though.
That's the one thing we'll confirm on the podcast today. That was not it.
I am I will believe a lot of things. Like, I believe in transubstantiation and that like the bread and wine at Mass turns into the body and blood of Jesus Christ, but I will not believe that. Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm out on that. Yeah. And so I think it's particularly challenging because I think that one of the things that we have to do is that we can't extrapolate outwards from ourselves. We cannot do that. We cannot say like, I think this, ergo, a lot of other people think this. And we can't do the annoying opposite thing, which is like, I didn't like this, which means all these people must love this. I'm like, no, that's not how this works either. As we saw, there were a lot of people who voted. I'm not sure. There was a thread on Twitter yesterday where someone was reporting from a focus group in which someone was like, well, I voted for Trump because it looked like Biden was going to win overwhelmingly, and I just wanted to be a protest vote. And I'm like, there are like thousands of people who were just like, why not? And it's like, that's just... The thing about politics is that most people don't do it all the time or think about it all the time. And most people don't want to think about it all the time. And I like those people, and they are correct. And so I think what this all means, I can't extrapolate outwards from what I know right now because I don't know enough.
Yeah, so I just want to push back on something a little bit. Sagar, two things. So one, the idea that X group of voters aren't coming back. Because I'm seeing a lot of people, we're going to keep referencing Twitter this episode, who are sort of populist right, American conservatives saying, oh, suburbs people, you guys are gone. It's no longer your party. It's sort of over. And I'm concerned and almost certainly sure people are not saying that because there's an empirical analysis of what's going to shift those decisions, but they're just saying it because they're trying to get rid of a part of the coalition who's inconvenient for them. If you're a populist, like nationalist who doesn't care about like taxes, who, if anything, is sympathetic to Steve Bannon's arguments actually about raising taxes on the rich. Like, obviously you want to say the suburbs are gone forever and the only inevitable path forward is to win minorities who are also working class. Like, you're going to say that, but like, that's not an empirical assessment. This also goes to Jane's point about needing to sort of wait to 2022 before we make those claims, because this is something you and I mentioned. We were sort of checked on the idea that the socialism argument wouldn't really matter to people. Yeah. And there's entirely a world in 2023, if Biden pursues raising higher taxes, if there is sort of this deficit hawkery conversation where those same suburban center-right former Eisenhower Republicans come back into the Republican coalition. So I just want to caution us against sort of wish casting what the coalition looks like, because that makes our policies inevitable. And then the last thing I'll add tier two, I want to push you on the other part about your sign the checks would sort of win here, because I think you're getting to the weakness of the populist cause, which is that like, under what sort of limited government framework or philosophy are you sort of operating there? Because since there's nothing really there, I don't see how you could sort of build something permanent out of that, right? Like the idea that we should sign checks, like that's basically sort of center-left policy. So how does that actually translate into something big?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, Jane. I want to get your take on this too. I've talked about this as well I've talked about this in the context of like Ron Johnson of Wisconsin and Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania. These are two of like the most hardcore fiscal conservatives within the Republican Party, and they happen to represent these battleground states, right? And it's like, how did this happen? And we have to be honest, they actually got, or at least in Ron John, like he outran Trump in Wisconsin in 2016. How the hell did that happen? It was white suburbanites. And so, yeah, like, look, I don't particularly want these policies to continue, but the test of this is going to be in 2 years, where I do suspect, you can hold me to it, I think Ron Johnson's going to lose because of exactly of this shift in the party, and because he's unable to bring back some of these people in. So whenever I say these people are gone, what I mean about it is the same way that like Democrats think about probably the white working class at this point, which is that you're never going to win a majority. It's just that you want to staunch the bleeding. So this is, I understand it, Jane. I mean, again, we shouldn't read too much in the exits, but that I was just seeing Josh Krashower say this is the first Republican election where the majority of white college-educated suburban women did not vote for Republican. I don't know how empirical that claim is. This is just, it's something I've seen from, and I trust Josh Krashower, but that seems to be very significant That's a Rubicon crossing moment. I don't know that you can come back with that. So I'm curious for your take.
I mean, I think that how you come back with that, and I will be mildly glib here, is you don't run Trump. Mm-hmm. You just don't do that. I think that it is going to be interesting once we are, at some point when the Republican Party is not running Donald Trump at the top of the ticket, or Trump Jr., the wings to Trump's Beatles. I think so much of this is that if you, and it's been interesting because you saw people who were like, who would vote for Joe Biden but then vote for Republicans down ballot? And I'm like, a lot of people.
Yeah, actually, no, like hundreds of thousands of people did.
Hundreds of thousands of people who were like, I am fine with Susan Collins, but I do not like this guy because I think that he makes conservatism look bad. And I think that that is something that people, and this is a side point, and I'll get back to your original question, I think that a lot of people don't get is that one of the things, people are like, oh, why is the left moving for the left and the right moving for to the right? And I think that the thing about polarization is that you have to genuinely think about it in terms of magnetic poles. And the degree to which Donald Trump manages to make any idea seem anathema to any liberal, where you're suddenly like, I was in favor of immigration restrictions, but now I'm not. I was in favor of X idea, but now I'm not. Like, if you, honestly, I was like, if you just ran a campaign that was like, Donald Trump hates this thing, people would be like, second look at whatever it is.
Right.
Like, like whatever it is, just tell people that Donald Trump either hates it or loves it and just see where people move and shift to. So I think that it'll be, what's going to be also interesting in a midterm is that what we saw in low-key, I think one of the most important elections that of the last 10 years, which is the 2014 midterms, which is that turnout dropped and people didn't care. And then a lot of things happened as a result of those 2014 midterms. And so I think that it'll be interesting to see what happens as the parties continue to shift. And depending on what happens with the economy, depending on what happens as a result of here, because I'm interested to see how far you can go with an understanding of Trumpism that is largely based on the person and not on a glommed on conceptual framework. Because I think that Republicans absolutely could win back white suburban women. I think that Democrats could absolutely win back some working class voters, especially with an understanding of what working class means here. Because I'm thinking, like, if you're thinking working class like coal, that's one industry. But if you're thinking like SEIU
right,
and folks in service industry jobs, of which there are millions, if Biden's thing is to really emphasize, as he has repeatedly, really emphasize unions, and Republicans once again decide again that they hate unions again, I think that'll be a really interesting shift to take place. And whether or not obviously there's going to be enough culture war, whatever. There's going to be somebody who does a thing that people don't like and want to get mad about on the internet. But I also think one thing, and I've been thinking about this a lot, there was a piece about a year ago in The Week that was talking about social conservatism, and it was talking about how so many of the attributes of social conservatism right now are not dependent on anyone actually doing anything about the thing, whether or not that's abortion, or whether or not it's, it was marriage equality, or whether or not it is these specific issues. It is, you are not actually expecting Donald Trump to ban abortion. You are not expecting anyone to actually do the thing. You just want them to tweet the right things about it and maybe use the right gifts about it and show up at these events about it while whatever it is keeps happening, because you have to have a carrot to keep pushing people along. And so I am curious as to see what happens as these culture wars heat up without the resulting action. Yes. I am fascinated to see what that ultimately results in, because one thing that I remember is that there's been a lot of conversation about how Donald Trump was low-key like the most pro-life president ever, because he basically was like, what would the Heritage Foundation like me to do on this issue? I will do that thing. But also, Planned Parenthood kept getting funding because that's just a thing that will happen regardless of apparently who the president is. And Mexico City, that's going to be something that's going to get changed again with a Biden president. And so I think that when you keep ratcheting up the culture war, but you don't give people and this is what you do about it, I am interested to see where that goes. Because on the subject of marriage equality, if you recall, back in 2004, major wedge issue. That was something that in 2008, 2009, Obama was not going to say that he supported marriage equality.
Right.
And then Obergefell happened, and unless you are attempting to fundraise on your idea that Amy Coney Barrett's going to overturn Obergefell, you basically are like, we moved on from that. I don't think that some of the issues that we talk about, namely abortion, are as easy as that. But I do think that it's fascinating to me that we have a number of these culture war touch points about which people get very angry about, but there's no real action. There's no real because if you have the idea was well, we're going to get people very angry, and then they're going to donate to these candidates, and these candidates win, and then we nominate these judges, and then the judges get on the court. And then you're kind of and then the judge will make the decision that makes these people happy. But as we saw this most recent SCOTUS term, that's not how it worked out. A conservative Supreme Court was trans people? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Well, moving on. And so you see this kind of I think that's something that actually, and this is a little unrelated, but that's actually something that concerns me a little bit, is that we have a media infrastructure that really heightens culture war contradictions, but without a action that can be taken beyond the realm of, well, you have to vote in this specific way. I'm not sure where that goes.
I completely agree with you. And it's actually interesting because I think that what it's paired with is against the fecklessness of a lot of conservative ideology, which doesn't really actually believe in doing government policy on anything. And so that just translates also into the culture sphere. I want to get to the second part of what Marshall had talked about there, about those stimulus checks and about socialism sucks, right? So this is a really interesting thing. I thought socialism sucks is one of the dumbest things you could possibly say in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of, the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. And it obviously worked, at least in Florida and in a few other places. The best explanation I have seen has been from Ross Douthat, actually. I've basically stole it, so full disclosure, that's where I got it, from on our last podcast, where he said, it's not really necessarily about the taxes or about the spending. It was the cultural element of statues coming down, chaos, the things that often will accompany socialist regime change in other countries. I'm curious for your take on that, because I just don't know how. I think he's right, because I don't know how else you can square socialism sucks resoundingly working in the state of Florida and pair it alongside a 60% vote for a $15 minimum wage. I'm that's the only thing that really makes sense to me, or maybe I'm just reading too much into it. What do you think?
I think that goes again to something I said earlier, which is that we are seeing an increasing separation between policies, $15 minimum wage, and the people behind those policies. Kind of this idea of it would be as if there were a band and you really liked some of their songs, but you hated the band. So you're I love these two singles, but I hate this band so much. Because maybe it's because you feel like you're supposed to hate the band, or you don't trust the people in the band, or you think one of the members of the band, I don't know, hates Israel or something.
Yeah.
But, the band keeps producing, have you heard $15 minimum wage? Have you heard, this other thing that you like doing? I think that really goes to why I think that ballot initiatives are secretly one of the things, and it hasn't required any exit polling data, one of the secretly the most interesting parts of this entire race. Because you saw on down ballot races across the country, you saw police oversight boards win. You saw drug legalization and decriminalization win by a landslide. I think a lot of people have been saying that, why is it that Democrats aren't just let's legalize marijuana today, man, because it works. It works and it's not even something that, it's not just works to turn out your voters. It seems as if the opposition to that is really not that well formed. It doesn't trigger people to vote against you.
Yeah.
One of the lessons of politics is that you need to have things that both turn out your base but depress their base. And I think what we actually saw this year was, with such high turnout, there was an idea that, oh, high turnout only benefits Democrats. I'm like, well, it benefits Democrats and people who really hate Democrats. So you had this dual, like, you had no depression whatsoever for anyone's voting base. And so I think that idea that, like, the socialism sucks message, I think that proved effective, especially with specific populations where they had a direct experience of extraordinarily bad forms of socialist practice. Mm-hmm. I think that, though, that what that means for them, though, had nothing to do with a $15 minimum wage. It had to do with, like, you know, having relatives disappeared in court proceedings that you never saw them again. Yes. Or seeing, you weren't allowed to say certain things or do certain things, or statues came down. There was just general uncertainty throughout all of your life. I actually watched a really fascinating documentary about a photographer who went back to Cuba multiple times over about a 30-year period. And one thing that I hadn't really recognized is that there was, like, this amazing halcyon time in Cuban history because the Soviet Union was funding everything. And then the Soviet Union fell apart, and they were like, oh, see, this is going to be a big problem for us.
The 90s really sucked in Cuba.
It was real bad, real bad. But, and, so much of what we think of as, the successes of more socialist-leaning governments also have to do with, like, natural resource expenditures. Mm-hmm. But as a side note, I really do think that that's a disconnection of policy, because if if you're working for Turning Point, essentially everything is socialism. Like, somehow that, you became convinced that, like, critical race theory socialism, which is, I'm not even going to get into that, but, like, I think that's
a take.
I am certain it is a take that's been made and has already been written about, and somebody made some money off of it. So kudos to you for rejecting socialism by making money off of bad takes. But I think that it really goes to that disconnection. It goes to the idea that you can reject socialism, but also think that a $15 minimum wage is a good idea. And I don't know how far that, if you told people in a specific area that, like, you can reject socialism, but also believe in, like, UBI or something like that, I'm like, I think someone's going to try it. But I think that really goes to the personification of politics is so interesting to me, because, these ideas become disconnected from the people who are making them, so much so that you have people who are very much in support, based on, again, incomplete data, very in support of a hypothetical Medicare for all, but will not vote for the candidates who would put forward Medicare for all. And so I think that disconnect is really interesting and kind of concerning.
Yeah, before Sagar and I did this episode, we agreed this will be the last time we relitigate 2016 to 2020, because we're honestly over it and we're running into unbacked up take space. So I think that's why your pivot to the New York Times and the argument is really interesting, because we listened to the argument. We love Ross. We like Michelle. It seems to me the argument so far has been about relitigating, or sort of litigating, the Trump era. Obviously, as you're coming on in 2021, there's going to be a new quote unquote argument. So, like, without getting too specific, because it's hard to even look a week into the future, what do you think the quote unquote argument is going to center around as we go into a Biden administration?
Well, again, because I don't prognosticate anymore, I'm out. I don't do it. I said I really have held to that I don't do it anymore. I think it's going to focus on really what we're actually trying to have conversations about when we seem to be getting into dumb culture war discussions on the internet. Mm-hmm. I think that there is an understanding that our politics is being shaped in a way that does not match the heterogeneity of voters. That people are not, when you saw people repeatedly saying, like, I don't understand how people could vote for Biden and for Republicans, I'm like, people are weird. They do lots of things that don't make sense. And I really want the argument and how we think about that to really showcase that. Because I think that one of the challenges that we have in our particular industry is that because of social media and because of the shaping of our own jobs, we often become mouthpieces for a very specific worldview, where we are conservative Inc. writ large, or we are populism writ large, when that's not how most people think. Most people who are, it's kind of the thing of how the same people who were very angry about Democrats being mad at the police were also mad at the police for enforcing lockdown measures, because it turns out everybody at some point doesn't like the cops. It brings us all together. But I think that trying to really get at the heterogeneity of ordinary politics, I think that that's something that Chris Arnade's book, Dignity, did really well, and he does a really good job of in general, is indicating that most people's politics is not, you ascribe to this specific political philosophy. Many people who think of themselves as being conservative didn't get there necessarily from like a deep reading of Edmund Burke, or Russell Kirk, or thinking about conservative through that way. They got there the way that most people do. Like, your parents were Republicans.
My dad
and you
voted
read
this
some
way.
stuff. Yeah, your dad voted this way. Or you do that thing where you then become the exact opposite of whatever your parents were. And then you start reading stuff like that. And then you're interested in these things, but you also think this other thing. It's sort of like, like I support these things, but then your tax bill came up and you're like, ugh, that sounds uncool. Like, I really want to get at the heterogeneity of ordinary people and how they think about politics, because so much of, I tweeted something earlier today that like, I think there's been an excess of debate club energy in so much of our conversations about politics. I did not participate in debate club because my high school didn't have one.
We both did.
Oh, you're looking at a debate club state champion here. All right.
Yeah, that checks out.
Yeah.
Two of them. Let's be precise. Two of them. Fact check.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm glad we bring that terrible energy.
About that. Yeah, I was on academics team, the pure science of just remembering things, which actually has been very handy throughout my life. But I think that the idea of our politics as a debate to be won or lost or scored in any way doesn't really get at what politics looks like for most people. Politics is how you figure out how much it's going to cost for you to buy your house over here, or send your kids to this school, or do this thing that you're just trying to do. Like, I'm looking out my apartment lobby window, and I'm looking at a restaurant that's about to open that's going to have ramen, and then there's a bar over there, but you can tell that like they've all had to do different things to deal with zoning. That's politics. The politics of, will there be a bar or restaurant that gets very loud outside your window? Who will you call if they get loud? Should they be allowed to get loud? Like, that's politics. And so I think trying to get at what that means is really important to me, because I think so much of our politics has been these yawning debates about, at the very top echelons, that then attempt to extrapolate outwards, where we pretend in our industry that because we care about these things, the ordinary populace must be very concerned about cancel culture or something like that, or not concerned about cancel culture. When I'm like, I think that there's sort of some truth on both sides, where you're like, I think this person should get fired, but I think this person is awesome, because that's how humans work. But I really think getting at the ordinariness of American politics in many ways, and trying to bring it down to the level of where people actually are, where the answers are sometimes, I don't know, maybe, or I would think this, but I want this to be true, but it's not true, which is sometimes the answer. So I think that that's kind of where I'm leaning. Again, there's obviously a lot of uncertainty. And I think that one of the things that when I think about my own work, do is try to take myself out of the picture. Because I think that one of the things I want to bring to the argument is that I have my own takes on things, but I also recognize that my takes are just my own opinions, the same way that, like, my opinion is that, like, I don't know, that the X should not happen, but X should happen. That's not based on, like, a political philosophy. It's just a thing, I think. And trying to recognize that people are coming in here, to have conversations or to think about these ideas in that same way, and trying to put all of that together in a coherent whole.
I think a lot about, Jane. I read this Texas Tribune profile. I mean, I'm from Texas, and I think a lot about this profile of Latino voters in the state of Texas. And it was basically like a huge subtweet at Democrats. And it was like, you can't take us for granted. And I was really starting to think about, I've probably mentioned it here a bunch of times. It's like, there are a lot of voters, especially in Texas, who are like pro-life, pro-gun, pro-fight for 15, pro-Medicare for all. And it's like, who the hell speaks to that person? Right? Like nobody in American politics does. And yet that's like probably a pretty good chunk of the population. And also that person would see no internal contradictions of their philosophy like whatsoever. Right?
No.
And so it's like, we're the ones who are screwed up here.
Oh yeah. We are.
Yeah.
For even having these conversations about internal contradictions.
Yeah.
Like it basically is essentially, I don't know if either of you were raised in any particular religious community, but it's essentially like I was raised Catholic, and it's basically every single person I knew growing up being like, yeah, my person and I conceived our child out of wedlock, but now we need to cover it up because we got to go get baptized, and there's no issue whatsoever. And we're like,
yes, exactly.
What? And I guess, but also the idea like, well, we just have to do this because we got to be Catholic, and like, okay. And so I think that even that concept of we are the people who are putting the concept of contradictions here. Like political philosophy for most individuals doesn't work that way. And I think that that's where, the irritating leftists in 2016 who were like, oh, like a Trump win will heighten the contradictions, really did not speak to how most people interpret politics, because there is no contradiction at some point that will get people to be like, and now I see that you're right. That's not how humans work. So I think that is something where if you have a coherent political ideology that runs through every aspect of how you see the world, congratulations, there are like 3 of you. That's not how most people work. And I think that that's not how most people necessarily should work, because I think that, as we've seen, a political philosophy should be malleable. There is, like, you can have strict or loose constitutionalism, but you don't really need to have that about how you see politics. Like,
yes,
you can think that like legalizing some drugs is a good idea and legalizing other drugs is a bad idea, and not be a giant hypocrite. And I think that that's something that I think I want my work to reflect, is just that like politics is complicated, and also most people don't think about it all the time, and the people who do, we are few, and it perhaps should be fewer, and that these ideas are complex. They're really complex because of those inherent contradictions that aren't really contradictions at all.
What I love about your point about the sort of gap between the way sort of inside baseball hyper-political people think about things and sort of quote-unquote normal people is you saw a lot of people on Rose Twitter, sort of leftist Twitter, making this insane argument sort of the months before the election saying, we need to like hold back our vote because that's the only way that Democrats will recognize the power of democratic socialism. I'm just sort of thinking like, no one thinks that way, right? So if you're a socialist right now, the person who you're ticked off at in your coalition is that center left or center right voter who went for Joe Biden and has no interest in socialism. But there's no world where that person is going to look at the ballot in 2022 and think, man, if I don't endorse Medicare for all, they're going to hold back their votes. And I guess I'm going to have to give, like, no one thinks that way. So it's just, I get why Twitter and take having incentivizes that sort of thought process, but it's insane how many different ways across the right and the left you see people sort of to the farther edges taking up that framework.
Right. I think that there is what I would call kind of boutique politics, where you have the politics where you never really win, but that's kind of the ideal because then you don't actually have to do anything. Correct. It's sort of how like you can be a Monday morning quarterback, but God help you if you ever actually became quarterback. It's sort of, there's I compare it to how there's a sports writer, Bomani Jones, who argued, I think in like 2012, that the greatest job in the NFL is to be the number 2 quarterback because you are always hypothetically winning. You're hypothetically a Super Bowl champion. Who knows what you could do because you never actually have to go out and do it. And so I think that I think it's very important for us to include practitioners of boutique politics in our political understanding, because I think that the ideas raised often go somewhere else. A lot of the things that we think about now as being conversational touchstones in our politics came from boutique political ideologies. We aren't having a debate about the breakup of fusionism if there aren't a bunch of social conservatives and populist conservatives railing against libertarians, a bunch of libertarians railing against social conservatives, and all those people up doing it in magazines that most people don't read, except me. They're pretty good magazines, but I think that it's worth. You can never extrapolate your own politics outward. You cannot think that because you and a bunch of people think these things, that would be a winning ticket in another place or in another reason. And I think that goes for everyone. I think that the people right now who are like, why we lost? It's because of this defund the police message. And I'm like, if they didn't have that, would they come up with something else? I think that, the understanding that these particular political strategies either always work or never work that's wrong. That is the only thing I will say is straight up wrong, because we've seen time and time again that there are places that a lot of times that politics sometimes can seem invulnerable to actual events. I was kind of darkly entertained. Heritage Foundation's publication, The Daily Signal, they did this write-up of here are how all these campaigns went in these places that had riots. And they were shocked that in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Oregon, all these places, how did Democrats keep winning despite these things happening? And I'm like, because they probably would have won anyway. And it turns out that an event does not necessarily mean that you take a second look at letting cops do these things that you don't want them to do. That's not how people do things. And so I think that it's really, if I had any overall message, it's I do not do this. I generally assume that no one has the same politics as I do. And whenever people kind of mesh towards it, I'm concerned. I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. No. It's like being a hipster, but a really nihilistic hipster, where you're just no, it's not that I'm ahead of anyone. It's just please let me be alone with no gun control, but these other things that are vaguely socialisty seeming, because whatever. Mm-hmm. I think that extrapolating your politics outwards gets very dangerous, because essentially then you are you're projecting. And I think that that's something that is endemic in our politics, is to project upon groups of people that, Latinos voting this way means they must be rejecting wokeness. And then if you went up to if you went up to every household in the Rio Grande Valley and it was were you rejecting wokeness? Would you be
what are you talking about?
A who? Yeah, no, that's not what's happening here. And so I think that's really important in my view of how we start thinking about things.
Mm-hmm. So our last question here is, what is your takeaway from the last 4 years as we're sort of tying a bow around everything?
This is a weird, wonderful country, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think the thing that I have found fascinating is that there was this moment right after the 2016 election where you saw an understanding from a certain number of people who either were incredibly pro-Trump or incredibly against Trump, that this changes everything and that everything will change. And then it turns out that the grinding gears of bureaucracy are way bigger and harder and more difficult to change than anyone thinks. The alt-right did not, ascend to the heights of power, and now most of them are sad and or in jail or being sad in jail. And with obviously very notable exceptions, a lot of the Trump agenda just turned into I'm a Republican president, but I also dislike a lot of you very strongly. And so I think that is something that I've learned, which is that the idea that the American populace is large and vast and incredibly diverse and wide in such a way that manifest changes are very difficult to make quickly, and we don't know the effects for years on end. And the idea that, for better or for worse, that the Trump administration was going to have these immediate swinging impacts on the American populace without, again, a backlash. I think that was something that, for some, I think a lot of people did not seem to foresee that. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's something that we need to think about in our politics, which is that, like, if you recall, like, the first thing in 2017 was the Muslim ban. And the response to that was that, like, thousands of people poured out in the streets and lawyers went everywhere. And the court system was like, we'd rather not deal with this, but okay. And every action then taken by the Trump administration was met with massive resistance. And I mean, I think that that's kind of how this works, is that you have a thing and they try to do the thing against the thing. And I think that there was a lot of a lack of understanding of what that would look like, even in our culture. Like, when people were very upset that, like, magazines or cultural entities started getting more left-leaning, it seemed like, well, this is a direct response to a thing that has happened. There was a rock thrown in a pond, and the ripple effects are that people were like, holy crap, that rock scared the crap out of us. We need to change how we do things. And so I think that's something that I just keep going back. I found it, there was a piece in Slate in like January 2017, and it was talking about like how Trump will change everything. And there was a side note, and I think it may have actually been by Michelle Goldberg, but I could be wrong, where she was like, I predict that this is, women are going to start wearing super high heels again, and everyone's going to start dressing in this very like Berlusconi era Italian low-cut dress kind of way. And I'm looking around and I'm like, the irony of the pandemic is that everyone's wearing sweatpants all the time and everybody is dressed in a more athleisure than ever before. And that just goes to show like how predictions often don't countenance for a backlash, how predictions don't often countenance for ramifications of your own actions. It's like that viral tweet that's like, me sewing, haha, this is awesome. Me reaping, oh, fuck this. Like it's basically, that's the last 4 years, is just, alternative sides, having these moments of being like, haha, we've ascended to power. Oh, crap. Now we're not. I'm like, it's just that back and forth, I think, is what I've learned the most about.
I completely agree with you, Jane. Thank you so much for joining us, and congratulations on your new gig. I know you don't get started till 2021, but whenever you do, hopefully you'll come back, and we'll encourage everybody to go subscribe there. So thank you, Jane. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jane.
Thank you. Sounds good.